Hi, welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the lunch break, coffee break. Can you all hear us? I'm thinking about lunch already. Sorry, it's a bit early, I know. But thank you very much, Pamela, for this kind introduction. Before we start, I would like actually all my wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. And the reason they are here, actually, they are all fluent Mandarin speakers, and they have very interesting stories to share. So Maurizio, pass to you first.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for inviting me to join this panel. My name is Maurizio Marinelli. I'm originally from Italy, and I started studying Chinese in the early 80s, a long time ago, being fascinated by what was happening in China since 1978, 1979, with the new opening up of China. And I've lived in China. I studied in Shanghai. I did my master in Shanghai in 88, 89. Then I lived in the US, China again, Italy, Australia, UK. And now I'm senior lecturer in East Asian history at the University of Bristol, where I teach Chinese studies and global studies. And I'm also the co-director of the Sussex Asia Center.
So my name is Matei Negrescu. I'm a senior advisor in corporate strategy at Equinor. It's an international energy company. I'm here in a private capacity, though. I'm also quite passionate about learning new cultures and languages. I've had the privilege of living in many different countries as well: Romania, France, the UK, Norway, Brazil, Algeria. And I started learning actually Mandarin 3 years ago, and for the last year I have followed the Chinese language and culture for business program at LSE.
My name is Mark Lindberg. Thank you very much, Catherine, for the introduction. So I graduated from Durham University with Chinese studies, and then I worked for the Clearing Center for Commercial Banks in Shanghai that was mentioned in the video earlier today. After moving back to the UK, I worked in non-financial M&A advisory, particularly with a focus with artificial intelligence, and I now serve as ambassador to the AIBE Artificial Intelligence in Business and Entrepreneurship Summit. Thank you.
Okay, so the reason we are here today is really to share our experience, insights, and to provide some kind of, hopefully, useful information and knowledge to help you think about how to overcome linguistic and cultural challenges when it comes to do business with China. So just to put things into perspective, so this is from South China Morning Post, and this shows you, first of all, there are pretty much about 1.2 billion speakers who are native speakers of Mandarin Chinese. So Mandarin Chinese is one of the most spoken language in the world as native speakers. And if you look at the language learning of the world, Mandarin Chinese is listed as the third most learned language in the world. So this gives the context why we're here. We're interested and passionate about teaching language, learning language, and focus on how to help individuals learn language and use language, overcome cultural understanding in the business context. So I've been told that the organizer actually collected some of the most frequently asked questions. So we are actually required to share our insights and answer these questions one by one. So I think, as far as I remember, it's about like 8, 9 questions. So I will be watching the time. It's about 3 minutes per question. We'll try to answer those questions. And if any questions appear to one of the particular panelists, please feel free to jump in. And then towards the end, that will take us about 30 minutes. And then towards the end, hopefully we have 10 minutes for the audience. If there's anything we haven't covered, any additional information you want to ask, please do that towards the end. So that's the kind of rundown. So should we start? Okay. Okay, first question. Does speak Chinese really help you and your business? Okay, shall we start?
Sure. Oh, I have to say, being able to easily communicate with a Chinese counterpart definitely is a benefit of twofold. First, we talk a lot about the concept of guanxi, and to be able to really develop that kind of relationship, which is what the word means, in their own language is a great tool to develop trust. And it's something that, really can't be substituted for anything else. But, Chinese fluency in Chinese is one thing, but another side of that coin is fluency in the culture as well, and the cultural understanding, both societal culture and also the business culture as well. And to maintain a fluency in both, you'll reap dividends very quickly if you enjoy such a benefit. Absolutely.
Okay, are there anything to add?
In my case, I started learning Mandarin more initially out of personal interest after traveling to China and being fascinated with the culture and realizing that it was impossible to discover the culture without speaking the language. So that was how I really started learning Chinese. But I work in the energy industry, and increasingly China is a major player in that industry. So I think that for me personally, learning and being able to speak Mandarin will have a huge professional value in the future as well.
I have to add something about probably higher education, because we have a lot of Chinese students in the UK, and also when I was working in Australia before coming back to the UK, speaking the language and really understanding the culture helps a lot in terms of not only delivering the lectures or delivering the seminars, but really in terms of, we have, for example, exchanges, many exchanges at the LSE, at Sussex, many universities with Chinese universities, and we have both Chinese students who are doing their BA or MA or PhD in this country, but we also have exchange students who spend a semester or spend a year in the UK. And the language, the knowledge of the language and the understanding of the culture helps a lot. I have a lot of students who, even though they are not my students, who come to me and ask me questions that go from basically A to Z. When I was working more in the kind of business sector, especially in the 1990s when I was based between Italy and China, the language, the knowledge of the language, understanding of the culture, even in that case, was quite important, because we heard today talks about joint venture creation or representative offices in China, and understanding the language and trying to work with Chinese partners through this kind of transformation, because it was a transformation that we have witnessed and we have experienced with China in the last 40 years. And it helped a lot, definitely, in many, many ways.
If I can add to that, because obviously we're both from higher education. I'm the only one just born to be Chinese. I didn't have a choice. I didn't have to learn. But obviously, without being able to speak Chinese language, I wouldn't be in my role and teaching Chinese. I actually initially went to Bristol to do my postgraduate study in 2001, and my major was language teaching, but it's trained as teaching English as a foreign language. And then by the time I finished my PhD, Bristol decided to introduce Mandarin as part of their degree option. And that was exactly also happened in 2011. LSE decided to introduce Chinese into its curriculum. And now LSE, this year, actually going to launch its first undergraduate degree named International Relations and Chinese. So you can see university itself invests a lot to develop and train future leaders to understand China, and Chinese language is an important component of that. And I think also in other industries, for example, I work with Chanel in terms of helping them try to understand Chinese customers, and they actually did a whole training for their store managers, 250, to understand Chinese basic language so they can engage with their colleagues. And as if you know, I think later we'll have a talk from the luxury industry actually in fashion, and pretty much every shop you go to, there will be a Chinese speaker who serve their clients. And that's the advantage, I think, to understand Chinese broadly in general. Okay, second question. Why can't you simply use interpreters or translators?
Well, I would say, in my own personal experience, I work in artificial intelligence, so I can speak Chinese pretty good, but when it comes to natural language processing, I don't know how to say JavaScript in Chinese, for example. And so you do need an interpreter at some points. Using an interpreter is key when you're talking about very, very niche subjects, like high technology, for example, and you just don't have the vocabulary to do it yourself. But at the same time, so I would say, so if you're working in such a specialized subject like that, then yes, an interpreter is always handy to have on board, particularly if they themselves have worked in that sector. But at the same time, you then have to pay the cost of using an interpreter, and that really, apart from the economic cost, of course, is the fact that it really slows down the proceedings. You have these very long, awkward pauses when the translation is taking place, and it loses the stream. And if you're really, particularly if you're the first time that you're meeting with that counterpart and you're really just in the relationship building stage, it slows down the proceedings greatly. So I would say, yeah, it has a time and place, but if you can avoid it, avoid it.
Do we have anything to add?
Do you want to?
I very much concur with what Mark said, and I guess it's needed if you are working in a specialized domain, but it's not sufficient. And having that knowledge, that at least minimal language knowledge, minimal cultural knowledge allows you to avoid some potential cultural misunderstandings, which are quite important. So,
Can I add to that? I think you need, obviously, it's a profession for a reason. We do need translators. We need interpreters also in the business setting. And I just think I think what I want to mention is if you want to use interpreters and translators, make sure that they also have that cultural understanding awareness and brief them properly in terms of who they are meeting, what kind of clients, what kind of setting. So, there's famous research study looking at a welcome meeting, comparing it's a Britain-China welcome meeting and the external factor of using interpreter. So in that particular study, they found the role of interpreter and their understanding of the setup is so crucial. So what happened in that particular meeting, which failed quite miserably, is that the British chairman, had the opening up speech, introduced all his colleagues, and then ask the interpreter, can you please ask the rest of the Chinese delegates to introduce themselves? So that's exactly what the interpreter did. So could you please introduce yourselves? Now, when the Chinese delegates start to introduce themselves, but also want to return a welcome speech, this person got stopped by the interpreter because the interpreter say, no, sorry, you're just asked to introduce yourselves. You're not asked to actually give a return speech. And then it actually caused a huge offense by the Chinese side, feeling, oh, the counterpart is not showing us equal status or equal respect. Why are we being stopped by returning a speech? So I think these are the things that even if, I think there's definitely a need to use the interpreter, but just be aware and also, train them to help them understand who you're meeting, what kind of context, and do that proper briefing before with the interpreters.
Mm-hmm. I think also this is very interesting, and I wanted to go back to a couple of points because the Chinese language, like many other languages, but I think even more than many other languages, in Chinese language we don't really have a correspondence between one word in Italian and English or French and the word in Chinese. So it's really, I think the Chinese language, even more than other language, involves what we call the hermeneutic cycle, the hermeneutic loop. And that means basically that in order to understand the part, you need to understand the whole. And so the language, the Chinese language is even in the Zhongguan, it's called Zhongguan, and when, the idea, the second character of this Chinese language word, it really involves the culture, the cultural understanding. The language is really connected with the culture. So I agree with Mark when he says, in very specialized cases, it's very important to have a person who knows the jargon, who knows the specific terminology. And it happened to me in the 90s, for example, to be in situations in which, the interpreter had to translate specific terminology about specific kind of machine tools and manufacturing, didn't know the terminology, and it creates complex situations. But I think together with the interpreter, we really need to have, as Catherine was emphasizing, somebody who understands the culture, understands the way in which a negotiation, for example, has to run smoothly, the way in which there is a certain kind of pattern and of template in terms of behavioral patterns in the negotiation.
Okay, great. So next one, is Chinese language really so hard to learn? Just out of curiosity, how many of you have attempted learning Chinese? Oh, wow, quite a lot. Is it hard? Yes? Okay, I want to give the opportunity to my panelists because they are, now fluent. So what's your take on this question?
Please,
I can go first. I would say that as with any language, it's primarily a matter of motivation and and practice. But it is hard to learn. I think that particularly for us native speaker of European countries, there's obviously the element of absolute novelty, right? So nothing that you can anchor yourself to. And there's some other particularly difficult aspects. I would maybe mention characters, tones. But there's also some aspects that are actually not that difficult, like the grammar, which is, I would say, relatively straightforward compared to some of the grammars we have in European languages. So I think, back to my initial point, it's a matter of motivation and practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, and you mentioned characters being one of the hardest aspects of the language. Yes, that's an unavoidable fact of learning Mandarin and learning Chinese. But there are little tips and tricks that you can use to facilitate that language, that learning process. For instance, you have semantic, phonetic compounds in Mandarin. You know, ma, for instance, horse, but then ma as well for mother. They have similar characters within them. And so you may be able to, you know, it's not going to help you read it out loud with the correct tones, but to be able to get the semantic translations across and, you know, the pronunciation itself, it does get easier with time. And when you start building a critical mass of characters that you recognize, being able to read things, even characters that you've never seen before, becomes easier and easier and easier. So the marginal effort to memorize characters and be able to say them and use them when you need to does improve over time. So I hope that's encouraging to some of you at least.
Yeah, I have to say that I was very privileged in terms of language acquisitions because I did 8 years of Latin. So when I studied, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and I don't speak them well at all, but I thought I could read, I could read and I could understand. And English was another story, of course. But when it comes to Chinese, I was really fascinated with Chinese language and Chinese culture, and I was really fascinated by the characters, these strange things that are the characters. And I really immersed myself into learning the characters, and also when I was in Shanghai doing my master's degree, I took an optional unit in calligraphy that is one of called the art of the three perfections in Chinese culture. So I think it's one of the issues that I had with Chinese is that there is no similarity, between Italian, Spanish, and French or Portuguese. For me it was easy, but with Chinese it was a totally different word. But at the same time, I think that the passion, the fascination, and also the kind of methodical in Chinese language, there are a lot of they emphasize a lot this idea of nuli renzhen, this idea of studying of diligence, a kind of systematic approach to the language. And always in my days there wasn't a lot of we had very simple pedagogical tools to learn Chinese. Now it's much easier, and we will talk about it in a minute. But I think that being systematic, being diligent, being conscientious is the translation of the Chinese word, I think, in your study and in your application to the study. Also this idea, is also a Confucian idea of the self-cultivation, that is quite important. And you will reap the benefits because it is, I think it's the most beautiful language that I've studied so far.
It's funny you all mentioned Chinese characters. I think I want to just make a point when we say Chinese language is so hard to learn. Are we, defining the language as, everything? Because as you know, actually you can speak Chinese language fluently without necessarily have to learn the characters. Or you can be a Chinese scholar, read classical Chinese characters, beautifully, but cannot speak the language. So I think for business, it's really thinking about what kind of outcome, what's your goal of learning Chinese? Do you really need to learn Chinese characters? Or you really want to have that initial icebreaker conversation? And it comes to if you only focus on, speaking language, and I think it's not necessarily that hard, as Madej mentioned, because the grammar is very simple, the structure is very much similar to English. So I think it's a matter of, whether you want to be all-rounded skills, like Maurizio, a proper scholar, yes, then it's going to probably take some time. But if you want to just be able to converse, focus on daily life, icebreaker, conversation, I don't think, it's that hard. Chinese is a tonal language, but there's so many other languages that is tonal. And in terms of Chinese characters, the same, because I study a little bit Greek, it's a different alphabet as well. So, it's just a matter of getting used to it. Okay, so Okay, probably most people want to hear this. So what strategy is effective when it comes to learn Chinese?
I'm going to have to ask for your forgiveness because I'm going to give a very boring answer. I think there's no better way than to literally sit down with a pen and lots of paper and just continually write out characters. I mean, I'm very sorry, it's not a very sexy thing to say, but there's no better way of doing it. Another tip that I used, especially in my university studies, is flashcards. Flashcards, particularly because it's such an image-based language to learn, to be able to constantly flip through flashcards and have the Chinese on one side and the English and the pinyin on the other, that's really going to help, connect the meanings and the tones with the characters themselves. And then on top of this, the sentence patterns are something that needs to be taken into account. We have said that, the grammar is easy. The grammar is easy, but at the same time, there are some sentence patterns that are very different to English, and if you can master those, you quickly sound like you can really speak Chinese, even if it's just a bit of an illusion, because you've memorized that particular sentence. But yeah, just sit down and do the work. Flashcards and sentence patterns, I think, are my three top tips, if you will.
I think you covered it all. For us as foreigners, I think those are the three major tips. I can't emphasize enough that, as Mark was saying, really writing, practicing the writing. Even in my days when I was studying Chinese, there was this idea of fuxi and yuxi. So you had to repeat the characters. On the day you were studying new characters, you still had to rewrite the character that you had studied the day before, and then you were doing the yuxi, the preparation for the new characters. All the textbooks were structured in that way. That seemed to be, really strict, but it worked well because that's the only way really to learn the characters. And then sentence patterns, I think that's very important because, as I said before, you can't really think of translating word to word. You really need to learn this in any language, but I think in Chinese this is really important because if you try to understand why do they say this in this way and how this word can be literally translated, it doesn't really work. So the sentence patterns and practicing the sentence patterns in the kind of context, contextualizing them is very important.
I very much concur with what has been said. I will maybe add one dimension, which is immersion, really. And for the other languages that I had the opportunity to learn, I had also the privilege of being able to live in the country of the language. This hasn't been the case for me with Mandarin, but I think still in London there's a lot of opportunities. It's an international and global city to get immersed actually in any language or culture you're learning, and Mandarin in particular, and it's about taking all the opportunities. Technology as well is offering some of those, so reading books, watching movies, making friends, going to Chinese karaokes.
True. I think I want to add to that. So obviously, I think in order to learn something, first of all, I think you need to understand how you learn. I mean, this is very individual. So what is your learning style? How you learn best? So it seems two of them enjoy learning by writing things down. Probably they're quite visual learners, but we also have learners who actually learn or pick up language very quickly by just listening to the sound. Each of us learn very differently. I think in order to gain something, be good at something, you need to understand how best you can learn. And then the second thing, very important, when we look at research, look at, bilingual, multilingual speakers, they all have something in common, which is they make the learning process fun. It has to be fun for you. Don't think this is a chore I have to do. You won't enjoy it. You have to enjoy it. But how can you make it enjoyable? Then it has to be something linked to you. So for example, I heard stories, people, this one lady, she wants to learn German, and her favorite soap opera is Friends. So she doesn't mind watch it again in German. Okay, so she started watching Friends in German and start to pick up a language that way. And I also heard another person, he finds, interact with native speakers is the best way for him to learn. And he was learning actually Russian, and he's got a very strange strategy. What he did is he set up a Skype account, okay, with a few Russian native speakers. So he said hi to one Russian speaker in one window. So this Russian speaker replied. And then he opened another window with a different Russian speaker, copy-paste the first Russian native speaker what he said to the second window to a different native Russian speaker. And then this Russian speaker also replied in Russian. So basically then he copy paste back. So he can see how two native Russian speakers interact with each other. After doing it a number of times, he figured out a very natural way how actually native speakers communicate in that way. So he learns it that way. I'm not saying you're all gonna now start to do that on WeChat, but I think the thing is, try to identify something is fun, that works for you. I think that will be one of the most important strategy. And also, I think I actually want to say, you also need to understand how the brain actually work in terms of memory, in terms of how we digest information. I'm not gonna against Madei say living in the country and immersion, that concept, but I think our brain actually work better if you do a bit every day in a consistent manner. If someone tell you, okay, join our immersion program for a week, we guarantee you can speak Chinese, it's not gonna work, okay? You might remember it the day after you finish the program, feeling quite good. 3 days after, you're gonna forget everything. That's just not how our brain help us process the information. So you need to work on your long-term strategy when it comes to language learning. So I think that will be my take on that. Oh, technology. So how can one use technology in language learning?
I will pass on this because there are a lot of different tools actually now that can be used to learn languages, to learn Chinese. I mean, I think there are specific programs that I will leave to my colleagues to talk about. But I think also I just want to say what Catherine was saying right now. The fact that you can use. I see it also. I don't know with my students who want to learn Chinese, they can watch films in Chinese. They can use specific the flashcards, for example. My generation of flashcards, I had the paper kind of flashcards, but now there are applications, there are specific apps where you can use the flashcards. And I think in terms of also this diligent, conscientious way of learning, having them on your mobile that you have with you all the time instead of having the paper flashcards at home makes a huge difference. But there are specific programs that probably.
Any apps you guys use you want to recommend?
I think maybe I can start. I think there's a couple of apps that I use on a regular basis. There's a very good dictionary that is called Pleco, and you can actually either write the pinyin, so the pronunciation, and you get the character, or you can draw the character. If you've seen a character you don't know, you can draw it, and you get the translation. And really, this element of having it just at the reach of your hand accelerated a lot my learning, because suddenly I'm in a context where there's Chinese being spoken, or I can read some characters and I can get the immediate meaning of what is being conveyed, which without that technology will not be possible. Another one that I use, it's an app called TCB. It's basically you get articles, news articles, and you can set the level of Chinese that you are at. So basically you get articles that are adapted for your level, and is based on the HSK, so the standard examination levels in Chinese. But there's many more, and flashcards and so on.
Yeah, I would say Pleco that was mentioned is definitely number one for me. And on top of that, there is a functionality within Pleco that has that flashcard ability, so you can write down your vocabulary list for the week or the day, however you tend to structure your learning, and then it will test you repeatedly. The other one that I've only just discovered, in fact, in the last 24 hours is WeChat. Well, I've known WeChat for a while, but within WeChat, which is the Chinese WhatsApp, you have an ability to, let's say someone sends you a message on WeChat, there's a function where you can only open your phone and unlock it if it'll show you a character from your vocabulary list, and if you don't know it, then you won't be able to respond to them, and it will continue to cycle through until you find one that you can respond to. So if you're addicted to your phone, this is probably, which is quite a few people nowadays, that's definitely a good way to go as well. Absolutely.
And I think if people who are interested in self-study, for example, nowadays we have a lot of MOOC. Does everyone know MOOC? Yeah, so mass open online courses. So, for example, our partner university, Tsinghua University, has a very famous MOOC for complete beginner course. So if you want to revise something or you want to start, you can do that. Locally, Open University also has a MOOC site for beginner Chinese. If you're particularly interested in business Chinese, you can look at edX. That's another MOOC platform that they have business Chinese courses. The only downside of MOOC is because it's open access, there's no commitment, so actually the retention rate of such courses are quite low. I think you need a very strong will to be able to follow out the course. And I think at LSE, what we do is we want to blend the delivery mode. So you have the face-to-face element, you also use the technology, for example, to give video feedback as opposed to traditional, typed track change feedback to the students, so they feel they can actually hear teacher's voice and the pronunciation. So all this, I think nowadays with technology, really, you can practice much more and learn anywhere and anytime you want. I think that's the...
Yeah, I just remember, and one more platform on top of that. There's, I think, Duolingo is one, but there's a Chinese version, and the name escapes me, so please forgive me for that. But it's essentially where you find language partners online. It's completely free, and what's really, really good about it is because it's a Chinese platform, you have language partners from across the entirety of China, and China's very, very big. So when you learn Mandarin, usually we're talking about the Beijing-style Mandarin. This is like the Queen's English of China. So if you want to learn Mandarin, that's the best. But if you want to go and you want to work in China, you live in China and do business with the Chinese, you really have to be able to understand China from across the entire spectrum of where people come from in China. And the accents can really mess you up sometimes. They certainly mess me up. So with these kinds of platforms, you speak with people from across the entirety of the country, and it makes your listening capability a lot more flexible as well.
Great. Okay. That's an important one. What is the crucial cultural knowledge you need to know when it comes to do business with China? I'm going to pass on.
For me, at least, apologies, I'm very much tech focused. So I think the main thing is, I've mentioned the word guanxi before. The concept of having relationships is very important, and it's something that's talked about a lot, particularly in the West, in this kind of context, when we're discussing doing business with Chinese. But I want to emphasize that is not the full piece of the puzzle. What you really need in order to fully leverage your guanxi or your network relationships is a strong value proposition. And in order to evaluate your value proposition, the best way and the best framework that I've ever come across is, are you offering something that the Chinese need and they require, but that they don't have themselves? When it comes to technology, for example, I'm working very much between China and the UK in this sphere. The main thing is China has all the data in the world and they have all the money in the world right now, so you're not going to be able to compete with them on that. What you can compete them with is human capital. England, particularly in the AI space, has world-class higher education institutions. And so when you're building a value proposition, you have to make sure that you're identifying elements that are not shared in China, or perhaps not yet. They're going to have it in 10 years, no worries. But you have to make sure that as long as you have a potent value proposition, only then can you fully leverage your network and your guanxi to make it big in China. So I would like to emphasize that's two sides of the same coin that needs to be addressed if you wish to succeed.
I think as in any business context, when dealing with someone from another culture, it's important to have an understanding of how the other side operates. So I think there's some Chinese values, concepts like the concept of face, for instance, that is very important to at least understand, if not master. But also the differences between Western value systems and Chinese value systems. So I'm thinking in terms of the difference between the collective versus individual perspectives, the difference between short and long-term approaches, the difference between direct and indirect approaches. So at least having an understanding of that and adapting that into your business dealings with your Chinese counterpart, I think is very important.
Yeah, I would like to add to that it's also very important to understand, like others were already saying, to understand that China consists of many parts and has a very interesting, in my opinion, but also very complex history. So one of the elements, as it was mentioned, the value system, integrity, respect, wisdom. These are all important concepts in Chinese culture. And I think also understanding really there is a module that I'm developing now also for the business students at Sussex that has to do with the lessons that we can learn from the history of the interaction between Europe and China specifically. And I think there are some I don't have the time to go into this, but we talked about this with Catherine also at the LSE. There is something very valuable to learn from history because China has become much more prominent in many ways in the last 30, 40 years, especially I would say in the last 20 years. But I think if we go back into the history of culture of China and we really want to understand the culture, this is very useful for us in the business environment, in the business negotiations. And it's not, as we were saying for the language, today it's so easy to find books, to find websites, to find tools that allow us to learn more about Chinese culture.
Okay, let's see. Because of time, we not need to rush. What advice would you give to someone who wants to learn Chinese but worries about lack of time? How many of you facing this problem? Or you just think it's too difficult, you're giving up? Maybe I comment on that one? I think, the lack of time is an interesting concept. Like, how are you actually lack of time? I think there's one interesting TED talk about how we organize time is very much depends on how our attitude towards the event itself. So if someone call you now saying your pipe is leaking at your home, you're gonna rush to deal with that issue. Well, but you can put, if your friends say, let's go to gym, you're like, oh, I don't have time for that. So I think time is very much depends on how you perceive it. Your attitude really is really important. If you want to learn Chinese or any language, I think you need to really have that motivation we mentioned before, and this belief that if you spend time, you will actually make progress. And I think the other one is, of course, then once you believe you can do it, you have the right motivation, then you can actually invest in the learning process, make it more fun. And you can always, for example, if you're a very audio learner, you can play the Chinese, podcast while you're doing chores. And if you're a very visual learner, whenever you're queuing, when you're waiting, you can play some flashcards. So I think there are little, tricks that you can do when you're very busy. Then you can make time. But I think from my perspective, most important thing is you do have the motivation, you believe you want to spend time, then you can shape your strategy, focus on what is most important for you, and you do it a little bit of every day. And if you want to do it, the best time to do it is the first thing in the morning, spend 10, 15 minutes, and then spend 10, 15 minutes before you go to sleep. So, actually, why we need to sleep is actually how our brain to restore the long-term memory. So one interesting strategy, I would say, do a little bit before you go to bed, do a little bit when you wake up. That will help you memorize better.
Yeah, I would just like to reiterate, because the amount of technology now that enables language learning, it really helps you generate time. So, you don't need to be in a classroom anymore. It certainly helps to be in a classroom and to get a formal education in language learning. I would always recommend that. But to supplement that, there's many, many different platforms now that can really generate time that you're otherwise using idly. And, if you're on the tube or whether you're waiting or queuing, I think is the example you used. There are so many things now that you can use to fill these times in a productive manner. And so the perception of a lack of time really gets eradicated if you utilize these platforms correctly.
Okay, so how long will you take to speak fluent Chinese? Do we have any text? Maurizio, how long?
A lifetime.
A lifetime.
But it is, as I said before, I think, and going back to the idea of time, it's really investing time in something that is incredibly rewarding because you learn the language and through the language and with the language, you learn a culture that is really opening your mind in new ways and then showing you new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing. And in this sense, even if it takes a lifetime, as it's taking for me and probably many other foreigners, it is worth it.
Do you have anything to add? Okay, I think that's all the questions that we've gathered. So I don't know whether we've covered, at least some of the things that the audience feel you want to learn, you want to discuss. And we have some, I don't know, do we have time for questions at all? Or?
Yes, we do, because the speaker before lunch is no longer available.
Oh.
So, yeah, maybe 3 questions and then go on to the...
Okay, right. Thank you. Well, now we can relax, right? I was right on the lunch. We don't have to rush.
Please.
I just want to make two interesting observations, which I think will support everything that you've said. My eldest son's just finished his A-levels, and he chose, not me, Latin, Greek, and German, which I thought was an interesting combination. And I looked at the statistics of A-level students that took A-levels in the summer. And this might be a sign of where the next generation are coming from, but more people in this country took Chinese A-level than German A-level.
Yes, that was last year, first time.
Yeah,
yes.
first time. I suppose another observation I'd like to make, and my memory has gone blank, but there is, for people who are interested in Chinese history, the BBC ran a series of commentaries on key Chinese characters. And I think that it was an Oxford professor. I think it was something like Rano or...
Ranamitter, yeah, Ranamitter.
And if anybody wants to do that, I would strongly recommend. It's a fascinating series, and I'm sure you can still get it on some form of BBC. I'm not an employee of the BBC, I hasten to add, but I found it particularly interesting. The question I've got, and I have travelled to China a number of times, and I concur with a lot of what was said. I can't speak a word of Chinese other than Baiju, I think is...
Baiju, very useful.
Very useful, and as I've already said to somebody, we shouldn't be having a champagne reception this evening. We should have a Baiju reception. But that's a suggestion for the next time we meet. My question really is a question of dialect. I accept that Mandarin is the Queen's English of Chinese, and people are a bit surprised that in this country we have people who speak Welsh, English, Gaelic, and those languages are just completely in the land of their own. Is it the same in China? If you spend your life learning Chinese, or Mandarin, I should say, not Chinese, if you go to Urumqi or you go to some distant part, and I think one of the messages that I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody here is the sheer vastness of China. Absolutely. Yes. That was the first impression when I went to Urumqi and realized that province alone was larger than the whole of Europe. you suddenly, it looks insignificant on the map, but until you actually physically go there and see the sheer size and the sheer disparate types of characters and nationalities and ethnic groups, you're not even scratching the surface. But the question I want to know is, if you're spending all your life learning Mandarin, I'm probably too old to do that now, when you go to the four corners of China, are you going to end up speaking English to somebody who only speaks Gaelic?
Can I answer that? It's a very interesting question, actually. Well, within mainland China, so about 800 million people speak Mandarin Chinese as native. I'm from Shanghai. I speak Shanghainese, which is very different. And also, so basically, the rest of the Chinese, they're bilingual. So when I was at primary school, I also learned Pinyin, like the rest of them. So I think, there is a huge diversity, but Mandarin Chinese is the national language, so everybody speaks it. I mean, if you have particular interest, I definitely come across people who speak already fluent, Mandarin Chinese, but also speak Shanghainese, and become a Wanghong because of that, internet sensation. It's possible, but if you know Mandarin Chinese, you can definitely communicate no problem within China, or at least, with people, anybody who's been educated enough to speak the language. Take my parents as an example. Obviously, they were born in a much, older generation. They haven't been to school to learn Mandarin Chinese properly, but they can speak it, but probably with a very kind of bad or not standard, accent, but they can communicate and understand that as well. But I think younger generation, definitely not a problem. As long as you have Mandarin Chinese, you can definitely communicate. And I think also the other thing is, then you also expand, like in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Vietnam. So the old figure that we see, that 1.2 billion, covers those regions as well, because they all, also communicate in Mandarin Chinese, but also there's other dialects as well. But I think it's basically, my point is that, if you only have time to invest in one or get one, language or dialect, Mandarin Chinese will be the ultimate choice.
I just get acutely embarrassed, my next door neighbour here, but when it came up is, what's the best way to learn Chinese? He said, get a Chinese girlfriend. So I would probably want to add or Chinese boyfriend, but that's probably something next time you should include in your answers.
Okay, great. It does happen. I mean, it does happen to a lot of our Chinese students.
Hi there. Thank you to the panel for your advice. As a fellow Chinese studies graduate from Leeds and Nankai Daxue, I echo a lot of what you were saying. My one additional tip would be to always have a notebook to hand to jot down any surprising vocabulary that comes up in the work environment on your day-to-day basis that you can then go home and practice yourself. So I handle international e-commerce for a British luxury brand, and so as I'm sure you know, that we have to produce a lot of content in Chinese when marketing to Chinese customers, and so I'm constantly having to brief Chinese copywriters and translators on material and key points and key calls to action. And even though I'm speaking in Chinese, one of the biggest difficulties I have is how to communicate and brief tone in language, less about what we're translating, but what's the level of tone in the language and the style, because obviously when we write something in English and write something in Chinese, the content can be very, very identical, but the actual style can be completely different, and even if you match the styles, it has a completely different meaning to the Chinese customers. So I'm just curious to know, from your perspective, what advice do you have in terms of communicating tone and style?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. Obviously, that's for people who are already at really advanced level of language and really want to mastering the language in terms of the, style. I think from one kind of quick advice I would say is look at how Chinese magazines, like fashion magazines or similar, so basically the authenticity of language use. So that will definitely help you to get to know, oh, this is how they present the product. This is the type of vocabulary they tend to use to describe certain product, let it be a dress or a bag. So you gradually get the input in a very natural way, and then you can try to adapt to your own product and your own brand. I think, because otherwise I'm not coming across any kind of specific courses so far focused on styles, and that's actually for very advanced level. I think most of the courses so far, as you know, is very much conversational and the function level of the language. What you are talking about is a slightly different way of learning. So my advice would be, because I don't think there's existing courses like that in the market, the easiest thing for you is to really exposure to the authentic. It's not hard to get those materials and try to build on that.
I also think, to add to that, that some kind of ethnography could be useful, both longitudinal and latitudinal ethnography, because of course, if you talk, you must be the expert on luxury now after all this work, but it's also very country specific and very specific to the culture, the way in which you propose it. So There are tools also with technology now that we can use if you don't have the opportunity to go there to do an ethnographic study in order to see how a certain kind of tone or a certain kind of way of presenting it is appreciated or how it can be, adapted to the circumstances.
Maybe to build a bit also on the point that you were making, Catherine, I guess that's what I was referring to earlier when I was making my point about the immersion part. And of course, that cannot come at the very beginning because you need that foundation, but there's one point in the language learning, and I probably haven't reached it in the case of Chinese yet, but I have in the case of other languages I've learned where that immersion is basically the only way to kind of get that natural flow and the styles and so on. And TV, I think, is a very good means of getting that because you get a very different type of language by watching movies or TV programs that you would get in your professional interactions.
And if you have a budget, you can do a market survey as well. Just get a group of Chinese shoppers and what text seems more appealing to you and why. I think that's all doable, and it's actually kind of a quite interesting research project. Yeah.
Focus group.
Thank you.
Last question.
Last question, can I do that? Thank you. Hi there. Three very quick things. Number one, you're talking about spoken language. I was taught very early on that if you want to learn Chinese, a Chinese child will need 3,000 symbols, ideograms, to be able to really read successfully in Chinese. And adults find that, I won't say impossible, pretty hard, almost impossible to do. So that was my first point. Spoken language, you may be able to cope with. The written language is a whole other problem, and I'd like to get your advice on that. The second one is this. There is a mantra which I sort of hold to, which is China's going to take over the world, but they're going to do it in English. They have far more graduates studying English, over 500,000 a year, coming out from universities, speaking English, able to negotiate and work in English, which is way away from where we are or are likely to be. So here's the second question. What can your organizations and others do, apart from the Confucius Institute, which is already making inroads, what can you do to really improve the teaching of Mandarin, in this country and around Europe in order to achieve that level of graduation in Mandarin that the Chinese are already doing in English as an international language? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. If I can, it's okay. I think the first one is very interesting. I think the thing is you need to distinguish the difference between learning a native language, like as the first language. So you're learning your mother tongue, the learning process is different as opposed to learning a language as a second language. So the first language acquisition process is very different from a second language acquisition process. And that is the reason when you talk about focusing on the speaking language, the child and adult will react to it very differently, even as the first language. And then it will definitely be different when it comes to second language acquisition. And I think for any international speakers who wants to learn Mandarin, Chinese, or Chinese language, you can definitely start with either Chinese characters or pinyin completely, or a combination. I think what choice you're gonna make is very much depends on what is your learning outcome. If, as I mentioned before, if you want to be a China scholar, probably it makes sense to start everything at the same time. You build a foundation equally. But if you want to focus on icebreaker, have that relationship, conversation, no problem. You don't need that Chinese characters at that stage. You can just focus on speaking, listening, and that will give you what you need to interact and entertain your Chinese clients. So I think that's my answer to your first question. And I think the second question is actually also a very, very good one. I think it's very much about this competitive advantage, how UK can prepare, ourselves. I think there are a lot of universities start to have degrees. I mean, Leeds is one of them, and LSE is relatively new. So this year, September, is the first time, actually, LSE never had 4-year undergraduate degree. This is the first time LSE has a 4-year undergraduate degree, international relations and Chinese, with not only 1 year abroad. It's actually interesting. Our program has to study abroad opportunity. So the students will go already by the end of year 1, spend the whole summer immersion to really consolidate listening, speaking after 1 year. By the way, this is for complete beginners. And then they're gonna go to China in the 3rd year. And then they will learn Chinese for specific purpose, which is IR. And then at our Confucius is focused on business. So I think there are more programs like that, and it does show you the higher education in UK wanted to address this problem. At the same time, if you look at modern languages, unfortunately, it's really declining in this country. There are many cuts of single honor degree, let's say in French, in German. More and more you see students want to have joint honor. So they've got, let's say, economics or IR plus a language combination. This tends to be the trend. And I think it's the right one because you want to equip students with the skills they need, but also subject speciality. So that's hopefully, the future for our country and build this next generation of leaders. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I'd like to also to say that, the idea that Chinese are learning English so we don't have to learn Chinese doesn't really work for me because we live in this world and each of us as individuals, but also as individuals who are embedded in a specific culture have something to bring to the fore. And the way in which, for example, I learned and I started rethinking about Italian culture living abroad has been incredibly enriching for me. And the way in which, when I was in China, I could understand through the Chinese culture, or I could relate to certain family idea, the idea of family, the certain values in the Chinese culture through my culture was another very important experience in my life. And I think I want to emphasize once again, we were talking about the A levels in Chinese language. There is also a group of academics, and I'm part of it, who is really trying to promote the idea of A levels in Chinese culture, which I think, so I want to emphasize the connection between the language and the culture. And I think for the younger generations, and I'm also the coordinator at Sussex for the students abroad for my department, I really would like to see more. We have, every university in this country has so many partnerships and ways and possibilities for students to spend a semester or a year abroad. And so I always try to, invite my students to think about it and to do it because we have, our campus is full of Chinese students who come here. I don't understand why we don't have to see more and more of our students doing the same. And also, as Catherine was saying, we really need to continue to work more on the language front, on the foreign language acquisition. Because it's true that there is this assumption that English is the universal language. But we live in a world in which there are many other languages, many other cultures, and we can all work together.
I would like to add, sorry, on the final point, you do quote the 3,000 character threshold. That does sound like a big ask when you say it like that, but they're not standalone characters. There are similarities throughout the vocabularies that really do help synchronize the pronunciations and the meanings and how to write it as well. You have the radicals as well, which often indicate the meaning or the heritage of that character. So yes, 3,000 words sounds a lot, but really, when you break it down into the subcategories and you look at, particularly when it comes to pictographic characters, it's very easy to learn. The character for fish looks like a fish. So it's not as daunting as the 3,000 word may make it sound.
Thank you very much. Let us end it on that note, ladies and gentlemen. But before the panelists go, since you have learned Mandarin, can I ask one of you to say,
thank you very much for listening to us. Have a good day further in Mandarin. On behalf of the panelists.
I think they should all say that. Say something. It's time to show off your Chinese. Oh, that's hard. Okay, Marissa.
Who's gonna go for it?
我们非常感谢你们听我们今天在这里讲话。我们希望你们学习了一些新的内容。假如有其他的问题，我们吃饭的时候、就饭的时候，我们可以继续谈。谢谢。
Ah.